producers of the film, Ric Bienstock, joining us in larger-than-life form. Ric Esther Bienstock, there's her name right there on the screen. In a moment, we'll have her up on the screen and for a conversation. And as mentioned before, we also are honored to have here Barry White, who I mentioned beyond being a senior historian at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, also worked for the Justice Department in investigations of Nazi criminals, and specifically that led to the Demjanjuk trial, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. How are we doing on the Skype here? As we get this go, and here we are. So, thank you so much for being with us.
Hey.
It's late there in Canada.
Hi, everyone. I promised I would get a headphone, so let me do that so that there's no echo.
We hear you loud and clear, and I hope you could hear us loud and clear.
Hi, New York. I didn't even have time to put lipstick on.
And Barry, thank you so much for being here as well. I don't know if you can see Barry. I don't want to move the screen so we don't unplug anything. Ric, I'm going to start with you with a question as far as how did this movie come to be? It's, first of all, I have to say, a beautiful film, a fascinating, and what really I think got me about this film is that it's nuanced. It's a perspective that is complex and brings new stories to the table. It's not, I mean, there have been many Holocaust films made that you could say tell similar stories at the time, but the details that this one gets into and the perspectives it takes adds fresh elements to the table that I think are an important way of keeping these stories alive and true. Can you tell us how this started for you?
Well, it's interesting because I was actually approached by a young, inexperienced filmmaker, and she had been working as a chase producer in news up here in Toronto. A chase producer meaning whatever the story of the day is, trying to find people to interview and bringing together a news story that would make it to air within a day or two. And she covered the story of this trial when it happened, and found it so interesting and nuanced that she wanted to make a documentary, but she didn't have the experience, and she came to me, and initially, if I have to be honest, I said no many times, because this is, I actually haven't spoken about this much at Q&As, but my mother is a Holocaust survivor, and I made a lot of films, and I've never been able to do anything about the Holocaust. In fact, I do things that have nothing to do with me, have nothing to do with me personally, and I just, because it's too emotional, too hard, and I didn't want to look it in the face, but she was very, very convincing, and we talked about the nuance and why weren't there trials, and also I said kind of what you just said, which is, what's new? What is the story we're telling that is new? Because I think there have been a lot of films about the Holocaust, and by the way, there should continue to be a lot of films. But I felt that we had to say something new. So that was the genesis, and then she convinced me because she's very persuasive, and then we jumped on board and tried to raise some money and realized that where the nub of the story was, and his trial really was just used as a vehicle to tell the larger story. We needed, we wanted that hook, and his trial is very interesting, and it was such an anomaly in that he was willing to testify, and so many others aren't. And so I found that I kind of questioned my own feelings about, should these guys go to trial? Shouldn't they go to trial if they're in their 90s? And I just thought it was very interesting to explore that.
Fascinating. Barry, I would love your perspective on this. How this trial how did this trial that we heard of now change things from a legal perspective?
Well, by the way, I think that you do a brilliant job in this film of laying out very complex legal and moral issues in a way that's clear, but also very engaging, and really lays out the human costs that are at stake. As the film states, the Gruening trial came out of the Demjanjuk trial that my office at the Justice Department pursued. But it was made possible by those two investigative judges, Kirsten Goetze and Thomas Walter. They were new hires at the central office, which did the Nazi investigations. So they didn't come in imbued with that dogma at the office that they could only try people for certain kinds of murder where they could prove hands-on connection to the murder of specific individuals. So they were much more open-minded, and they were very gung-ho. They really wanted to find cases. And I was the OSI liaison with the central office. We worked very closely together. And one day, Thomas Walter saw a news clip about the Demjanjuk case, and he emailed me angrily about, why haven't you ever talked to me about this case or sent me the evidence? And I wrote back, Thomas, I have given the central office the evidence in all of our cases so many times, in so many formats, on CD, in binders. Well, I can't find them. Well, come on over. And so he and Kirsten did. And they finally listened to us, really listened to what the theory was in our cases, which was, in our cases, we had to prove assistance in persecution. And so we were successful in proving that someone who served in a unit that killed people just because of their race or religion, or that persecuted people like a concentration camp just because of their race or religion or national origin, political belief, that they were part of that process of persecution. They assisted in it. And they began thinking about what that would look like in German law. And so they came up with a theory that made it possible to prosecute the case.
So just to explain to us who are not lawyers in the room, explain to us more about this theory.
Well, in the case of Demjanjuk, who had been guarded at the Sobibor killing center, and Sobibor,
which we're screening the film about it tomorrow night.
Yes, okay. And so a minimum of 170,000 Jews were killed at Sobibor in about 14 months. And the staff at Sobibor consisted of about 20 Germans and maybe 120 non-German SS auxiliary guards, like Demjanjuk. That's all the people who were at the camp. And they were all involved in the killing process. They were all face to face with the victims. If they weren't pushing them into the gas chambers, they were loading them off of the trains and beating them, and beating some to death in order to terrify the others, to move them along in the process, and taking those who couldn't walk around back and shooting them behind the gas chambers. Everybody was involved in that. And that was the purpose of their service. Just by serving at Sobibor, they necessarily participated in the murder of those victims.
Thank you. This is fascinating. Of course, gives us a deeper understanding of everything that I think this film, in many ways, was about. I want to know a little bit about the process of the film. At what point did you start making the film? Was it after the trial was over? Was he still alive? And how did you go about getting all the interviews and rounding everybody up? What kind of process was that? Please walk us through as much as you can.
Well, all films, it's always a long process, and I should say, I should have said earlier, Ricky, who is my co-producer and kind of initiated the project, brought me on, but she also brought on Matthew Shoypit, who is a young director, also who has some experience, but not a lot of experience. So, but they were so passionate about the topic, and they had gone on March of the Living, and that's where they had met. And they kind of, we started shooting before all the financing was raised, and started piecing together all of the people that were part of it. And the trial, he was still alive. In fact, there was a period of us very much trying to get access to him and to interview him. And initially, we were very frustrated that that access was so difficult to get, and then realized that, or we felt that the film is stronger without him. There was nothing else he was going to add. That what we were able to see from the trials and from his previous BBC interview were enough to give us a taste, and that the interview could only be a disappointment, which is, an unusual thing to say in a documentary. But we started putting it together. We had the help, and it's absolutely true. The German prosecutors were so passionate, and we worked with them, and we filmed some of the other trials that were happening in Germany. He wasn't the only trial. In fact, they just now, very recently, I think this month, wanted to have another trial, but the gentleman was 95 years old and was deemed unfit for trial. So they're still going after the last few people, and it's hard to explain a film process, but you sit in the edit suite and start feeling where things resonate. I mean, the one thing, besides establishing the Demaniak trial, what we were interested in is how, in Sobibor is one thing, but even Groening, he was an accountant. He took things from the Jews, but the entire, what was very telling to me, sorry, I'm rambling a bit, was when, I think it was Dershowitz who said, Hitler probably never killed anybody. And you realize that so much happened, and it's all the people that were cogs in that wheel that make it happen. And it's kind of an obvious thing, but every once in a while when you sit back and realize that, you realize that how stunning that is as a revelation, that it might take 1 or 2 or 10 or 100 evil leaders, but it's the cogs that are actually allow the machine to function. And we were very interested in that and wanted you to feel that when you watch the film and meet the characters.
Before I open it to questions from the audience, and I want to turn it over to them as quickly as possible, I have one last question for both of you, which is, what are the messages from this film, from your work? In 10 years from now, there might not be anybody left to prosecute. What are the messages you are hoping to bring today to the audiences through this film, through the stories, through the prosecutions? Obviously, justice is not exactly what we're getting. It's more a message that we want to send. And I'd love to hear from each of you what your message that you would like to give.
Well, I just want to follow up on your observation that it takes many, many, many people to commit genocide, who act in many ways and out of many motives. And one of the most common risk factors for genocide is a past incidence of mass atrocity in which the perpetrators were not brought to justice. Because genocide is usually an extreme event and an ongoing cycle of violence. And to break that, justice is really an essential part of it. And it's not enough just to bring the leaders to justice. You have to bring some of those others. You'll never have perfect justice, but you have to bring the other kinds of perpetrators to justice as well. Otherwise, what's to prevent them from going along with the next leader of mass murder? And what's to convince the survivors when they see the people, their neighbors, who killed their family and took their property, still living in peace? What's to convince them that they don't need to resort to violence to protect themselves? And so, as Ben Ferencz said, it's not really about retribution. It's about the principle. It's about building a world in which what the Holocaust can't happen again. And Elie Wiesel said that the way we truly honor the victims of the Holocaust and their memory is by trying to build a world in which the Holocaust cannot happen again.
Thank you. Rick?
Wow, that was so beautifully put. Thank you. I mean, of course, I agree with everything you said. And you know, when you make films like this, you know you're not going to change the world, but we felt that, which is one of the reasons why we put Charlottesville in and all of these kind of right-wing rallies that are happening all over the world, because it's very easy for people to look at history, especially the youth now, and think that was history and not understand the reverberations of that kind of thinking and that kind of ideology today. And it exists today, and even there are atrocities going on as we speak, and in a way we're helpless too. Look at what's going on in Yemen and Myanmar. So you know, our hope always with things like this is that the more screenings, the more people become aware of our potential complicity in things, you know, the more educated they are about that, the better it is. We just want to spread that message. And we really had some wonderful screenings here. One of the school boards here had screenings with some of the survivors who were in the film, not to Jewish students, but 12, and it wasn't particularly school, and that was really unbelievable for us because, of course, we're very multicultural here in Toronto, and there were, you know, people from all over in the audience, and these kids ask so many questions because so much stuff isn't in their curriculum, and it's very, very gratifying because I think they start to understand. They just hear the word, you know, Holocaust, and I'm sure you all know people always talk about Holocaust fatigue, and which is a very frustrating term to hear. But we just hope that we kind of shed new light and give it a bit of a twist, so people get that message.
I think you absolutely do, and I think a film like this needs to get into our American public school systems, and it's definitely going to, I mean, I think it's a film that needs to reach the young audiences who should understand that, right, they might not be leaders, but even if they're joining and supporting acts like this, that they are part of the problem.
Right.
As we open it to questions from the audience, I want to give a quick shout out and mention that we have another special guest here. Fred Wasserman is here, who's the acquisitions curator for the Museum of for the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. And he welcomes the opportunity to speak with anyone who's interested in donating family artifacts, correspondences, personal belongings to the museum. Fred is right here.
I'll be outside afterwards.
And we'll be right outside, right after the screening, in case you want to connect with Fred. He's an interesting job. We'd love to take some of your questions. We're going to pass around the microphone right here.
I found the movie very, very moving and very, very well done. And your compliments to you. You began to talk about one of those issues that troubles me a lot, because you suggest at one point that the Germans did not want to make these prosecutions in the first decades or so extensive because they had to keep these people in society. They gave them 3-year terms or 5-year terms, and they really didn't allow, they didn't want extensive sentences. And then there's a discussion, the flip side of that is that the Americans or the West was somehow somewhat ambivalent also as to the extent to which these matters ought to have been, the perpetrators ought to have been prosecuted more aggressively and more extensively. So I understand what you talk one time, decades, I'm sorry, thousands and thousands of people would have actually not been able to go back to society if you put them away. I get that, but there's certain justice somehow, the German system must have defined justice as well as the American system, and I think, or the West, and we accepted that. I'm curious, it's not clear to me who really is at fault here. And you said until '67, I think you said, they really weren't prosecuting for extensive terms, if I understood correctly.
Well, so once the Cold War started, it wasn't just the Germans, pretty much everybody the world over lost interest in justice for the crimes of the previous war. In the late 50s and 60s, Germany was the only country pretty much that was prosecuting, other than the Eichmann trial, Nazi criminals, which is of course appropriate. But one of the problems was because the Germans considered the crimes charged at Nuremberg, crimes against humanity especially, to be ex post facto law. In US and in German law, you can't punish a person criminally for something that wasn't a crime at the time it was committed. So they decided to use regular German criminal law to prosecute these crimes. And one reason we develop international criminal law is because regular criminal law isn't really cut out for justice in the wake of mass crimes. And so the particular way that murder is defined under the German criminal statute meant that, and by the way, most of the really top level Nazis were brought to justice, but you had all of those upper level and middle level persons. And for the most part, they could only be charged as accessories to murder. And the sentence for accessory to murder is less than for murder. I could go on, but I won't. You'll get the word.
Rick, did you want to add to that?
We got cut off for a bit, so I didn't hear the whole answer, but I hope listened to part of it. But I might suggest there's a great podcast by lawyer Philippe Sands, who works at the International Criminal Court, called The Rat Line. I don't know if any of you in the audience have heard it or listened to podcasts, but it is a kind of very good story about, it's one particular story, but it's very interesting. And it is a little bit about post-war and what happened with some of the Nazis. And so I don't want to say anything about it, but it's called The Rat Line. And if you are into podcasts, I highly recommend it.
Thank you.
With some regularity, there are on TV and on radio discussions of what has happened in Rwanda and the whole truth and reconciliation process. And every time I hear about it, I'm so conflicted, like, it's great for them that they could work it out that way, but somehow it doesn't jive with me. When you hear these stories about, these truth and reconciliation commissions in various places, what impact does it have on your understanding of the Holocaust, or what impact does your understanding of the Holocaust have on these contemporary events?
That's an interesting question. We realized in the wake of the Holocaust that there are other avenues for justice besides just trying people and trying all of the people who are involved in the genocide, as you said, is impossible. But that doesn't make it impossible for the victims to have some form of justice. And there are different ways you can do it. And there are different requirements for justice. And one is to acknowledge the truth of what happened and of what the victims suffered, and to try to make the victims whole, and to try to keep it from happening again, and from keeping the people who were involved at least from ever holding power again. Those are different things. Ben Ferencz actually endowed a special international justice initiative at the Holocaust Museum, run by the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide, which works to build capacity in local civil society and amongst victims after periods of mass atrocities, to help them come up with the mechanisms for justice that will be most appropriate for them and their society and their society's needs.
Thank you so much for the film, and please don't stop making films about the Holocaust. I don't know who to ask this, but it's a minor question. Regarding the Holocaust survivor that was looking through the archives trying to find his family names, where is that?
That was at, I think that was at Auschwitz.
Oh, that is Auschwitz.
Mary, do you know?
Yeah, I thought it was at Auschwitz. Oh, okay, thanks.
The audience concurs.
I'm a little curious about if you know how the witnesses were chosen, how they found them, how they chose them. There were still, I mean, my parents were in Auschwitz and they are not alive now, but I still know other Auschwitz survivors. So I'm just curious if you know anything about that process.
Well, I know that they were concentrating on Hungarian survivors because the focus of the case was on that 8-week period in which about 430,000 Hungarian Jews arrived at that ramp where Oskar Gröning served. And so that was their focus. So that's why all of the survivors that you see there were all from Hungary, or territory that was held by Hungary in 1944.
That's exactly right.
We're going to have time for 3 last questions. 1, 2, 3. It's okay.
It was somewhat striking and unexpected, at least to me, to see the grandson of the commandant of Auschwitz. I wonder if you can tell us a little more about that person, his views, and what kind of life he's led.
Rainer has been actually, there was a film about him and about some other grandchildren of higher level people in the Holocaust. He has really spent a lot of time, he speaks at a lot of synagogues, he does a lot of Holocaust education stuff. He's very close to the woman Eva, who famously forgave Gröning. And he's a hard man to read. It was hard, I have to say, for me to kind of, I think he's doing good work, but it was hard for me to tell how sincere he was sometimes. But certainly, he really feels like he is carrying the weight of what his grandfather did. At least that's what he communicated to us, and it felt true. I mean, just imagine. I don't know how I would react if I knew that about my parents or grandparents. So, but he has done a lot with it, meaning he's a very public grandchild of that commandant.
There's a question up here.
Hello. First of all, I really appreciated the movie. I've seen a lot of movies about the Holocaust, and every time there's a new light, new events, and a new view on what happened and what is still happening today. So my question is, you didn't approach that in the movie, but are there any political or historical events that made the German justice and government, I suppose, but justice mostly, change their way of approaching the trials and the German rules about how to try those people?
Barry, you should take that.
Well, the main thing was the different theory, but I think it also helps a lot that you have a whole new generation of German judges who aren't personally tied into the past and who are more open. And on the whole, Germany has done more to try to confront its past than almost any other country I can think of. And so I think that there was a greater openness in German legal society to listen to this new theory and to really give it, consider it to be credible.
There's time for one last question over here.
Thank you very much. I found the movie absolutely moving, and especially certain incredible things happening in the movie. Especially that Eva forgiving this is incomprehensible to me. What we do know is that survivors from Auschwitz, they have one of two reactions. One party never stops talking about Auschwitz because there's a feeling of obligation to perpetuate remembrance, etc. And the other party suppresses their experience in Auschwitz and never talks about it. I had a friend in Basel whose aunt survived Auschwitz, and she belonged to the category of people who never talked about it, suppressed it completely, until one day she had to go to the emergency room in the University Hospital of Basel, Switzerland. She had to roll up her sleeve, and the young nurse said, "Oh, what a brilliant idea to have your telephone number tattooed on your arm." That was the turning point. Thank you.
I will say you're absolutely right about that, and one of the things that was so impressive about Bill Gleed and Hetty and Max is it's not that they always talk about it, but they would go on March of the Living, and as many survivors do, my mother did not talk about it. She didn't suppress it, but it was not something we talked about, because they feel it's important as survivors to continue to share their stories so that it's real for youth. And I think that's very commendable. And I want to say something about Eva, because you say you don't understand her, and many people were angry that she did that, and angry that she was in the film. But we had our world premiere at a festival here in Toronto, and Hetty and Max were in the audience, and they came up for the Q&A after. And when I left, this man came up to me and said, "Why wasn't Eva at the Q&A? Because she's the heart of your film. She's the very essence of your film." So, I mean, I don't understand Eva, but you know, people feel differently. Some people, she needed to do that, I guess. So, just thought it was very interesting. He thought she was the heart of the film, and that we were remiss in not bringing her to Toronto.
I want to close by saying I think one of the brilliant things about this film is that that on one hand you get to show the complexities of the German side of this story, and I think that's something that's important to understand from the human element, because we might not be always on the side of the victims. We might be on the other side, and that's something to remember, that they were accountants there. There were people there doing people's jobs in the most human way, though I feel also in the most inhuman way. And I think the real brilliance of the film is that at the same time you bring up these stories and you really give time to the testimonies of Auschwitz that have been heard before, and some people dedicate their lives to telling these stories, but but the fact that we're bringing them to a whole new generation, to audiences once again, and possibly, sadly, maybe for the last time, these stories are being recorded and being kept and retold up on the big screen, and hopefully distributed as widely as possible. You get to really get a somewhat of a full picture of the atrocities of the Holocaust, and to know that some things are not some things are black and white. Not everything can be gray. When you hear these stories of the victims, there's no question of the complexities. I want to thank you both so much for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you, and my very talented team, Ricky and Matthew and Randy, thank you too. It takes a village to make a film like this, it really does, and they were very passionate.
And on behalf of the Holocaust Museum, I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Barry. Don't forget about Fred Wasserman here as well. And we look forward to seeing you at other screenings tomorrow. We have 2 screenings.